Welcome to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, here to share some amazing conversations. We're talking business, health, making and saving money, or starting something epic. Think of this as your go-to spot for stories that do a lot more than just kill time. They spark ideas, give you a boost, and perhaps even change the way you look at the world. I'm pulling in the experts, the thinkers, the doers, and the dreamers. We're about to dive into stories that open doors and ideas that light up your brain. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. I'm your host, Desiree Stanley, and with me today is my guest, Leslie Draffin. How are you today, Leslie?
I'm doing so great. How are you?
I am wonderful, and I am so looking forward to this conversation. It is a new topic for me, as I shared before we began recording, and I am excited to bring this to the audience. You are a women's microdosing and somatic guide, and you're also a teacher, a coach. You work with women on menstrual cycle education and mindfulness mentorship. And so I'm so excited to talk with you about this today. Thank you for joining us, Leslie. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation too.
Wonderful. Well, let's start, as I love to have my guests share. How did this journey begin for you? What was it that led you down this path? How did you discover microdosing? And take it away.
Well, like you said, my name is Leslie Draffin, and in a former life, I was a TV news anchor for about 15 years. So I really found that I came to this work as a somatic guide and a microdosing guide because of my own journey. And I think that's how a lot of people come to it. I really spent about 20 years deeply numbing out and punishing myself with things like eating disorders and alcohol abuse because of this deep wound around worthiness that for me was something that was implanted even before I was born, but really got activated when I, at 18, was diagnosed with herpes. So, as a preacher's daughter from the deep south of the United States, where it's very conservative, I really sank into this shame spiral at 18 that left me feeling even more dirty, even more worthless, even more unlovable. And so, what I did was got addicted to hustling and achieving and trying to prove to everyone around me how good I was. And what I ended up doing is I tied up so much of my self-worth into what I could achieve and what I was doing successfully in my career. And I was really good in my career. When I left TV, I was making six figures. I was at the top of my game. And from society's standards, I looked like I had it all, but internally, I was falling apart completely. My anxiety, my depression, and what I would later find out was PTSD were all really just making me feel so stuck, so burnt out. I was drinking pretty heavily, went to therapy, got prescribed medications. Nothing really seemed to help me connect all the dots completely until I started to really work on connecting again to my body, connecting to my body's natural rhythms and cycle. And when I started to microdose psychedelic mushrooms, that was truly, I think, the aha moment for me that helped me heal my mental health, helped me get sober. I've been sober for 19 or 20 months at this point. And again, like overcome body image issues, understand what it really means for me to love myself. So this also put me on the path to helping other women just like me. And I think for me, my mission here is really to help people reconnect with themselves and find lives that are joyful and even in the darkness and in the darkest points of those beautiful, joyful lives, have the resilience to overcome what comes up for them.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I just want to say that I find that many people do that hustle, that work harder, that try to prove how good you are, how worthy you are, how smart you are, whatever the case may be, because internally we don't feel like we are. So we do whatever we possibly can externally to show that. And I think that it's pretty widespread, right? I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of women that do that. And so thank you for sharing your journey. And what an experience to go through, just realizing that you are worthy without all of that external proving the trophy awards and whatever. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to really dig into the idea of how microdosing really can help women very specifically more than anyone else. So why don't you tell us more about that?
So I started to microdose in early 2022. And at that point, I was still a TV news anchor, but I'd also already begun my personal coaching practice around the menstrual cycle. And I remember when I hired my coach, because I started working with a guide from day one when it came to microdosing. And I had gone to her to help me with sexual shame, with issues around libido. And what I had written in my journal, and I actually found it about a year and a half later, was this thing. It was like menstrual cycle and microdosing question mark. And I'm like, when I found it a year or so later, when I was in my training to add this into my own business, it was just like this funny little synchronicity that like I and my highest self were already thinking on this line, along this line, well before it came into my consciousness. So I really think that women can benefit more than almost anybody from microdosing and psychedelic use in general because of the things that we struggle with on a fairly regular basis. And you really hit the nail on the head. Issues around worthiness, huge for those in female bodies, but also chronic pain and also pain related to the cycle, especially for, 30 or so years of our lives, maybe more. So when I began to really explore my training around psychedelics and leaning on the knowledge I already had around the menstrual cycle, I formulated this hypothesis that if we microdosed in tune with our female hormones, we could overcome things like PMS, mood swings, and elevate mood all month long. And I have absolutely seen that to be true. I think that psychedelics do such a great job helping women reconnect to themselves, understanding some of their wounds, their trauma, their self-limiting beliefs, kind of whatever you want to call it. And because of the really loving and gentle way I see mushrooms, they kind of just reconnect us back to what it really means to be a human on this planet. And it's something that I think women often get lost in, right? Because of the way society treats us and the way society makes us feel like we need to be chasing the next beauty standard or chasing the next job and plus holding it down at home. And if you don't have kids, like, oh, what the heck is wrong with you? And if you do have kids, but you want to say, like there's so much blah, blah, blah happening out there. Mushrooms for me and for a lot of my clients have helped to redefine what it really means to be a woman and be a person here on this planet, living in their authority and living in their authenticity.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And you're so right. There are so many pressures that are put on women, be the best mom and wife and worker and all of these things that we may want to do anyway, but the pressure that is put on us to be all the things in all the places is really absolutely impossible. And so this is amazing that you have found a way that you can help yourself and others work through these issues and figure out what it means to be alive in this world, on this planet, in this time with these experiences. So that's so, so cool. I love that. Let's talk then about how this helps us with anxiety and our mental health. And then let's dig into how it also helps with the menstrual cycle in terms of what you just shared, pain with the cramps and PMS and all of that.
Yeah. So starting off mental health wise, that's certainly been something that I think, along with my sobriety, are the biggest takeaways that still daily improve my life. And so when we look at how psilocybin, which is the psychoactive ingredient in these mushrooms, works, is it tends to soften the really rigid upper level processing center in our brain called the default mode network. And so if you're someone with anxiety or depression, your default mode is anxiety or depression, especially if you've struggled for a really long time. Now, the default mode network is also where we have our deeply held beliefs, our abstract thinking, the sense of self. And it's kind of where we can process and go about daily life without like thinking. If you've ever driven to work and then like suddenly you're there, Your default mode was running the show. And so in that subconscious level, that subconscious part of our mind can get really, really rigid around the things we think about ourselves. And so no amount of affirmations, no amount of talk therapy is really going to do much to change that space because of how rigid it is. Now, when we are exploring psychedelics intentionally, there's something called rebus, which is the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model. And that is this, phenomena that they have discovered helps to soften that area of the brain and help us naturally question our beliefs, become more receptive and responsive versus reactive when new information or new triggers come into play. And it can really help us change the way we look at ourselves. It's the way that I do my work is like a sprinkle of science, but like mostly in the mystical, mostly in the spiritual, and very much in the body as far as somatic work goes. So that's a fifth grade level of like how the neuroscience works. But with anxiety, right? So much of us think our anxiety is only in our mind, right? But in reality, our body is making up 80% of the language, the story of what's happening. Yet we often, rarely, if ever, explore what's happening in the body. And if you're someone who's had anxiety, you might like hear me say this and think immediately to those anxiety attacks, right? Like we know what's happening in the body, but we're ruminating our thoughts like we can't get off the hamster wheel. The way I work with psychedelics and folks with anxiety is to help them first understand the body's language, to understand different ways sensations speak to us, and then help us reframe the way that we're thinking about the sensations and the emotions and the stories we're tying to those sensations. So it really is a reconnection to the body. And then the last thing I'll say is even at tiny doses, which a microdose is a teeny tiny dose, you're not tripping, you're not high, you're not hallucinating at all. You're able to gain the benefits of neuroplasticity. So while your default mode is kind of tuned down and is thawing, there are other parts of your brain lighting up. So when you add in intentional habits, when you add in reframing your thoughts, when you add in embodiment and somatic practices to help regulate your nervous system, you can shift into a more mindful state, and your anxiety probably won't be gone forever. It certainly isn't for me. I had a horrible bout with anxiety like 3 months ago, but now I know what to do when it happens. And instead of living there in that like spiral of just feeling like everything is a dark cloud and you can't come out of it and everything feels dangerous, I have a really great toolbox that I can lean on now that sometimes involves microdosing and sometimes doesn't.
Thank you for going into that detail and especially pointing out that when we're talking about microdosing, we are talking about very small, minute quantities here.
Mhm.
And just to make the picture clear for people, we're not talking about levels that are going to cause you to have those kind of experiences that you may have heard about
Mhm.
and have been afraid of your whole life. This is very, very tiny amounts that allow your brain to expand and explore, right? In a safe way. And you shared about the neuroplasticity, and I've had guests on, we've talked more in depth on that topic. And I absolutely recommend people do research on that because it's so fascinating and so important in development of our brain and how it really is changeable, adaptable. And then you talked about how in our body, so much of it is stored in our body. And that's another book that guests have shared. It's the Body Keeps the Score or something like that.
Mhm.
And I can include that in the show notes. But these things that we think are all just here are often in our body, stored in places in our body. And until we can kind of make all of the connections, it's not going to be sort of relieved and let go of. So I
Right.
think that's great that you shared all that. Can we talk about how embodiment practices, like things that people can do if they're doing this for the first time, and really like having a coach or having somebody like you there to walk them through this is absolutely important, right? So wouldn't you dig into that a little bit with
Yeah.
us?
When I first started doing embodiment practices and they really kind of came, my side of the internet showed me it in 2019. It is a lot more mainstream now. It looked like just dancing around and like twerking and like ecstatic dance. And I love that now, but my God, like I hated it at the beginning. I was like, you will not catch me dead doing that. So if you're someone who is seeing that as like the big part of it, let me just redirect. So embodiment literally means to be in your body, and you're in your body right now, but like, are you? So when we work with somatic tools, my thing is really simple, really gentle, really accessible ways for you to start listening and learning what your body's trying to tell you. And, there's no shade or judgment to anyone who doesn't understand what their body's saying because we are never taught this. So it can look like simply taking a couple deep breaths and starting to notice what the difference is in the temperature of your body as you breathe. It can look like noticing what parts of your body move as you breathe. It can look like body scans. I think body scans are so nice for beginners and like even for advanced practitioners. They're so interesting at giving us a lot of detail. And what that looks like is simply maybe closing your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that, or lowering your gaze and starting with your focus and your attention on the top of your head, and just slowly letting your mind's eye and your awareness travel down your body and noticing if anything screams out at you. If you're someone who has chronic pain, shit will scream out at you real quick. Pain is such a valuable and, painful as well sign from the body. Tension is something that folks almost immediately will pull out to me. What are you feeling in your body right now? Tension. Yeah, of course you are. And resistance. Because I think that those are things we're sort of wired to notice first. And so I'll often work with folks and say, okay, and under the tension, what is it? And under that, what is it? And when did you experience this first? So embodiment is one, getting quiet enough and still enough to just sort of notice and get curious. You're a beautifully curious explorer traversing this world with your body as your best friend. And then when you do come up with something, say tension, say pain, tightness, what's it trying to show me? What's underneath it? Is there a story behind this? And oftentimes, especially when I'm working with clients who are also microdosing, you would be shocked at the things that will come out for them when they start to pay attention to like a tension in their body. Does that explain it? So it's little things you can do right this very second, and many other things can be embodiment as well. Yes, dance, twerking, shaking, walking, grounding, breath work, meditation, mindfulness. So many things can help us get into our body. And the way that I help people is to not only start to notice those things, but start to question and be curious about what they're showing us too.
Yeah, great explanation, Leslie. Thank you for that. And I think the idea of that kind of free flow movement can be very scary for people who are used to feeling like they're in control of their body, where that kind of movement is so not. You're just the free flow movement, whatever your body feels like doing, can be very scary for people who've never done it before.
Yeah.
So taking your time with something like that, being in a space that you feel comfortable doing that, maybe if you're afraid of what somebody else might think of you, doing that privately so that it's just you, I think is a good way to kind of step into that.
Mhm.
But, and not to make light of this, but when you were talking about the things that you're discovering as you're scanning your body, it's like the check engine light is on, but we ignore it in our
Yeah.
cars, right? And so this is pain, is the check engine light of our body telling us that something is not right here.
Mhm.
And so often we just completely ignore it
Yep.
and move on with our life because we're just too busy with whatever it is that we've got going on. But how important is it to recognize that pain wherever you're experiencing it, whatever it may be? What is it telling you? And what should you be paying attention to? I think that's so important to remember, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's too an important part because a lot of times the pain and the dis-ease are, like you said, like a signal, but they're also like low sometimes, or I don't know if low or high would be the best thing. They're far down the line, right? They often might be one of the first things, but there could be a subtle shift let me just, I'll explain it with a tiny story. So when I was my first marriage, looking back, hindsight is always 2020. There were a lot of signs that that wasn't working. And one of those signs was that I was allergic to his semen. Now, that is a very visceral bodily reaction that, yes, I think had something to do with our physiology and the differences in our pH balance, but energetically, as I believe, there was also something screaming at me that this man is not faithful. This man is not someone you need to be with, right? And I had had those clues prior to that allergic reaction happening. And yet I didn't want to believe it. I was at that point in my early 20s. I was still dealing with my shame around herpes. And I was with people who I just felt like, oh, God, I'm so lucky that they want to be with me, right? Despite the fact that they were pieces of trash. So your body might start to tell you things and you don't hear it. You don't see it. You don't notice it. And that's totally okay. Pain can be one of the first things you might be experiencing and noticing, and it can be farther down the line too. I guess that's what I was trying to explain.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, we do often ignore a lot of signs that for whatever reason it may be that we don't want to recognize them, though, although subconsciously we do recognize them. We're just sort of not trying to pay attention to them for whatever reason, like you shared.
Yeah.
It could be that you feel unworthy, but like, oh my gosh, this person wants to be with me. And so you just accept it.
Mhm.
And I think there's so many women who live their life that way. And for whatever reason, I'm not judging, everybody has to make their own decisions, but you don't have to live that way. Right. And you've shared that.
Yeah. And I think you also pointed out something so fascinating too. We often, regardless of if we're talking about relationships, we're talking about self-care, we're talking about whatever, we often don't feel worthy of taking that time because, like we said before, society tells us we need to do this, 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 and this. And so I do think that for me, one of the biggest struggles of getting back into my body, even when I started this journey in late 2018, was like carving out the time to dedicate to my own healing and understanding that that was just as valuable as going to the gym. That was just as important as what I was eating, or if I was going to the doctor regularly or getting a dental checkup. Like, it was at the same tier, even though society wanted to put those things as like more preferential.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And we don't think about self-care on the same level as seeing the dentist or seeing the eye doctor or getting your annual checkup or whatever. It's really the same thing.
Mhm.
It really needs to be, considered on that same level because it is so truly important. If we are not taking care of ourselves, we cannot be any good to anybody else. And so recognizing that, I think, is a big deal. And I really want to talk about now how, because you share a lot about womb reconnection for women. And I had asked you before we started about what about women who've had hysterectomies? How can we reconnect to something that's not a part of our body anymore? So, can we talk a little bit about that and
Yeah.
what your thoughts are?
I think that anybody, no matter if you have a womb or not, whether you were born with one or not, so those also born in male bodies can benefit from womb work. And what I mean by that is reconnecting to the energy of creatrix energy, to source energy. And that's at the broad level, right? Like creating this connection to things like Mother Earth, creating a connection to your creativity, right? And because we all come from a womb, that's partly, I think, why anyone and everyone can benefit from that reconnection to the feminine. Now, when we're talking about people who have had a womb but no longer have a womb, not only are we, one, still going to benefit because we are living in a body that most likely is someone who identifies as female, but if you've had it removed from you, my goodness, the amount of trauma that can leave within you, like those are the folks who might want to reconnect with the womb even more than anybody else. So when we look at the way the womb works in our bodies and spiritually, my beliefs around the womb, this is the place where we create life. This is the spark of life, but the spark of our own joy, our own authenticity, our own power. And because of the way our society works, I know we're going way back and blaming a lot on society, but it deserves it, honestly. It stifles that. It makes us feel that We should be ashamed of the things that happen from our wombs, that we should just ignore the issues we might have with our wombs. And if you had to have your womb removed because of those issues, my goddess, more than anybody else, how long it probably took for you to get those things listened to. So, womb work can look like simply doing a meditation where we go into the womb and we experience what it is happening within the body. I also do encourage things like womb massage, which is just a lower belly massage. Get some really pick an oil that just feels so yummy and sensual and just give your belly and your womb some love. And if you're listening, you're not quite sure where the womb is, I like to say it's about halfway between your belly button and the top of your pubic mound, right? Like where, if you have hair down there, like we're halfway between there, kind of in the divot between the hips. The other thing about the womb is that it is a very spongy, tissue-filled space that, depending on where you are in your life, you might be filled with a baby, might not. Might be filled with period blood, might not. Might be there, might not be there. But energetically, that fascia holds on to stored emotions, stored trauma, beliefs, thoughts, and sort of like what you mentioned with the book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. We know that there are deep connections between our body, our fascia, and stories. So if you've ever gone to a massage therapist and cried the whole time, or maybe even just a little, you're working on a knot, all of a sudden you're crying. I'm speaking from my own self. That happens to me constantly. You're releasing something, and you don't even have to know what. Same thing happens with when you're connecting to the womb. So I'll tell another story, and this is TMI, but that's my life. So there's something known as internal vaginal massage or cervical de-armoring. And what that is, it is a bit more in-depth type of womb massage. But I don't teach it to people, but I had learned this from a teacher and was doing it on myself. And basically, it involves using either your hands, fingers, or, which is a lot easier, a glass or crystal wand/dildo. And thinking of the vagina as a clock, 12, 3, 6, 9, internally massaging via pressure point massage around the clock. So entering into the vaginal canal, of course, going very slowly, lighting some candles, making it sensual and an experience that feels really, and starting at the entrance of the vaginal canal and massaging the points of the clock. And then maybe going a few inches more deeply into the vaginal canal and massaging, and then further and further until ultimately you come to the cervix. So I had started doing this work right after I got off the hormonal birth control pill, and I lost my libido completely. And I started to remember, as I was connecting to my cycle, all these old stories that I had held about what it meant to be a woman and what my cycle meant. I'm having this moment with myself, giving myself an internal vaginal massage. And when I get to the upper right quadrant, probably 3 inches into my vaginal canal, I feel a pinch. I feel like pins and needles. And then the voice of a man I dated after I got divorced, who was a total narcissist, comes into my mind. Had not thought about this man for years. And he says, "You fat bee." I'm like, whoa, dude, what? I have not consciously thought of you for, at this point, probably 4 years. But he was there. That voice, that story, that belief was there in my fascia, in my vaginal canal. So that's just a kind of extreme way to understand what I talk about when we connect with the womb, when we connect with the vagina, with the vulva, and the power that our fascia and our tissues have to really hold on, white knuckle on to those issues that have happened to us throughout our life. And it can be big things, right? Like SA, like big violence done on you, and small things like the tiny self-betrayals that you are speaking to yourself probably daily when you look at yourself in the mirror. So all sorts of things can live there. And the nature of that place is like an energetic junk drawer. It's a bowl. It's like, I got one next to my door. I stuff all my crap in there when I walk in without even thinking about it, clean it out monthly. But that's also how your womb is. It stores things whether you consciously understand it or not.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Leslie, thank you so much for going into that level of detail. I think this is completely new to me in terms of discussing the womb at this level. And so thank you so much. I think
Of
it's
course.
just so fascinating and just like new ideas to think about. And so I hope the listeners, it may be an uncomfortable topic for
Hmm.
people who have never thought about this before in this way. And
Right.
so I hope that you are kind and gentle with yourself during this, these thoughts in this conversation and in this experience. If you're going to try this, I think everyone should. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and I just want to also remember to point out what I was doing was more advanced level stuff. So you absolutely can. You have the power and the choice to do whatever you want. And if you want to learn more, highly recommend Rosie Reese. She is the woman who owns Yoni Pleasure Palace out of Australia. She has a monthly membership called the Golden Yoni membership. That is what I was in for like a year. And she talks a lot about that. And so if you do want that, go there.
Okay. Thank you for
Yep.
that. And I'll include the information in the show notes for the listeners, but also the depth of talking about the life that is created, and all of us came from a womb. So yes, we are the life that was created in a womb. And if you have one or you don't have one, as you shared, you do have experience with a womb on some level. So
100.
remembering that and exploring the thoughts around that, I think is so interesting and worthy of our time
Yeah.
to do.
Another thing that I'll share quickly too is that so much of our unconscious trauma can begin in utero,
Mm.
can begin before we are born. There is an excellent book called Waking the Tiger by Dr. Peter Levine. And he talks about how in utero trauma is one of these core subconscious things that can happen to people. And you're not ever going to know that to talk about that, but it could be why you are anxious. It could be why you have higher cortisol levels because of that flush that might have happened to your mother. I'm adopted, so I always say my birth mother, but to your mom when you were in her womb. And so when you think about that and that connection, like, wow, yeah, we really all can benefit so beautifully from this work. And I also think that's one of the reasons why pairing this work with mushrooms, which are very much womb like, you've got the mycelium network, which helped to make Mother Earth so fertile. It just like they pair so well hand in hand.
Mm.
And you get into the subconscious when you do psychedelic work, even at the microdose level, and you can uncover a lot of things that you didn't consciously understand.
Yeah, great point. And tying that back together with how the microdosing really can make this even more effective in helping you to work through your traumas and anxiety and help your mental health as well. So great stuff. Let me see where I want to go with this next. So we talked really in depth about the massage, the womb massage, but can we talk a little bit more about how this idea of pleasure, not just in healing, but also, in terms of womb reconnection and all that, but the traumas that we may have experienced. Can we talk about how pleasure can help heal
Mhm.
trauma?
For sure. You know, first, I think that what's important is what do you even think about the word pleasure? Like, I thought it was a dirty word. I thought that was just like, oh, something you did in the bedroom. And yes, that comes from my own religious upbringing. But first and foremost, when you hear that word, what do you associate it with? And so for me, what I have begun to see pleasure as is a deep dive into sensuality and the sensuality being of the senses. And so I say that pleasure can help heal trauma because when we really make this commitment to sensuality, we're looking at making a commitment to going slow, to soaking up all of the things in life that really can help us notice what's happening in our bodies, noticing the sensations through sensuality. And when we can create that slowness and that safety, that's one of the reasons and one of the ways that we can help our nervous system get out of things like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn and into a state of peace and safety, parasympathetic, where we can begin to move through and heal and become more resilient in the face of trauma. And so that's one of the reasons why I say pleasure can help to heal trauma, because it helps to create safety. And if you're someone who has had an experience of violence, if you're someone who has had an experience where, pleasure and sensuality or pleasure and sex, I should say, were dangerous for you, maybe you don't want to look at pleasure being the way into your trauma healing journey, but maybe you can start to look at sensuality as that. Because sensuality can be taking a bath versus showering. It can be slowly noticing all the little flavors of the food that you're eating. My favorite practice is to stand outside in my backyard with my feet on the ground and watch the sunrise or the sunset. So those tiny little moments, those little glimmers of safe senses, safe sensuality to help you create a state within yourself that feels more calm and more at peace. I think those are really great gateways into getting into that trauma work.
Yeah, great point. And thank you for saying that when we're talking about sensual, it's the senses. That's the base of the word, right? And so it could be even just what you're eating or what you're drinking. And I've shared my first sip of coffee. It's just like the enjoyment of that. And so this is really what we're talking about. And the idea of taking a bath, something where you're using essential oils or something where, the light touch of the skin. It's like these gentle things that are sense based. So feeling, seeing, hearing, touch, all of that, right? I think that's great stuff. So thank you for really showing how it's encompassing all of that.
Mhm.
And I have taken to recently standing in my backyard with my dog running around doing his zoomies and enjoying the sun coming up. So it's the fresh morning air and watching the sunrise and just starting the day in such an amazing way. I have found has just been tremendous for me. Just watching the sunrise is so, so fabulous. And taking that time to do that, we don't often do that. We don't take the time to watch the sunrise. We might see the sunset, but most people aren't up early enough to see the
Yeah.
sunrise. And so to do that is another way that you are taking pleasure in life and being alive. And so I think that's fabulous. And not to mention it helps reset your clock for
Yeah.
sleeping, right?
The circadian rhythm.
Getting out first thing in the morning for that morning light resets that clock to help you have better sleep.
Yes.
Another topic. Can we talk about you have 9-minute practice that you share that helps improve mindfulness. And I love that you say there's no meditation required because I think so many people are like, I can't meditate. I can't sit still. I don't know how to do that. So
Yeah.
would you share that with us now, what this 9-minute practice is?
For sure. So this is called the shift method, and it stands for seeking sensations, honoring what comes up, inhale, flow, and take stock. That's what shift stands for. You don't have to remember that. It's okay. Because the gist of it is that you're going to spend 2 minutes in a brain dump journaling, like super fast, journaling what comes up for you. You don't have to write full sentences, but you can if you're really fast at writing. 3 minutes of breath work and 4 minutes of movement. Now, I know I already said you don't have to be going crazy with that ecstatic dance. The movements that I really recommend are things like swaying, stomping your feet, walking in place. You can just stretch through cat or cow if you're somebody who understands those yogic positions. You could lay on your back and tilt your pelvis up and down. Maybe you just want to give yourself a little loving self-touch during that flow part. But I have a playlist and I could love to send it to you. You can put it in the show notes with 3 songs. So journal for song 1, breathe for song 2, move for song 3. And then at the end, we take stock. Okay, how am I feeling? Probably in my body and hopefully a little bit less in my head. And so that's why I created it because, like you said, I was someone who, when I started my spiritual journey, thought meditation was the end all be all. I got trained in meditation so that I could do it right. And it didn't really work for me in the ways that I saw people online expressing it. And I think for me, what I've noticed is my journey, it's all coming back to the body, of course, but sitting in stillness was not necessarily the thing that the feminine would have been doing. the feminine would have been in flow. The feminine would have been in touch with their body. And so that's one of the reasons why I added those 3 elements. Now, the breath portion, breath and I have been like really on like a buddy system lately. The breath portion can be just as simple as you breathing through your nose and out through your mouth while you notice the temperature change in your body. Or you could practice something like in for 4, out for 4, or in for 4, out for 8. There are so many amazing breathwork techniques that you can use during that 3-minute song. Take which one feels good for you. And if you've got no clue what breath exercises look like, I have just launched a YouTube page where you'll get new videos weekly. And I'd love for you to come check it out and see some very quick breath techniques. But that's the gist of the shift method. And I developed it because when I lost my soul dog this summer and was in an incredibly acute stage of grief, I knew mushrooms were not what I needed to be dealing with. Mushrooms are fantastic. And if you're in an acute state of grief or anxiety or depression, they can make it worse. So I was like, I don't want to commune with the mushrooms right now. And so I really looked for ways to deal with the grief and the anxiety that came up too because of him not being around in a more somatic approach. And so that's how the shift method was born. So you can do it whether or not you're microdosing or not. I'm leading a group right now of people who are doing it while microdosing, and the effects have been so amazing. So whatever you decide, the shift method can be a really nice daily practice for you to shift out of that over anxious thoughts state.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that with us, Leslie. And I think that it is an easy, approachable way for many people to do getting into a routine of something they've never done before. And so you've made it very easy for people to begin a practice that can help them. And so I think that's excellent. I'll include the link to your YouTube in the show notes as well for the listeners to find you. Now, I want to talk about, you also have a podcast.
I do.
And so you've got YouTube that you've just launched and you're sharing things there, and now a podcast that you've had for a while, actually, and it's The Light Within.
Mm-hmm.
So would you share with us what the show is about, what you're talking about, and when you release episodes?
Yeah. So the show was born in 2021 because at that point I was still a news anchor, and I would do these weekly segments called Your Best Life that I had to like censor into like a tiny 2.5-minute chunk. And the pandemic was raging at that point, and I had gotten the opportunity to interview some really cool people who had amazing things to say. And then I have to chop them down into like 2.5 minutes. And I was like, that's so sad. Also, I like to cuss and talk about things that are super taboo. So I was like, we're going to have uncensored conversations. So The Light Within is literally anything that lights me up. It looks like spirituality, sexuality, wellness, mysticism. And it is entering its 5th season this coming January. New episodes release on Monday, and I take a break at Christmas and in the summer. So I think the last episode of this season is on 11/11. Of course it is. And then it'll come back in January. But I've had so many amazing guests. I really enjoy it. And it's funny when you're like, you do the podcast, you do YouTube. I'm a generator in human design. I'm a 1-3. So like your girl likes to do explorations, and she likes to do too many things. So that's why all that's happening. But yes, The Light Within season 5 coming in January.
That's fabulous. I think that's great though. If we dig into who we are and what we're about, I mean, we can really fulfill our life's purpose. And so that's what you're doing, recognizing who you are and how you are, and leaning into that to create. And so I think that's fabulous. So do it, girl. I mean, yes, do a YouTube, do a podcast. So you're covering all the bases too. I think that's great. And when you're sharing stories that you have for yourself that you think people need to hear, or other people are coming on to share their story, it's serving the world. And so I think that's beautiful and I love it. Good stuff. I'll share the links in the show notes.
Perfect.
So before we begin to close out, Leslie, I always love to ask my guests if there's books that they want to share or other podcasts they'd like to recommend that they think the listener should check out. And we've shared a couple of books so far, but is there others that you want to specifically shout out now?
One of the podcasts that I love is called Mindful in Minutes.
Mm.
I think it's by the Women's Health Network. It's fantastic. Even if you don't like mindfulness or meditation, this is a really good one. I also am obsessed with Insight Timer. Like Insight Timer, take my money every year. Like it is such an excellent tool. And there are courses that you can learn. So it's not just sleep music and bedtime stories and meditations. There's breath work. There's courses on breath work. There's courses on all kinds of things. So highly recommend Insight Timer. I've mentioned a couple of books. You mentioned first The Body Keeps the Score. To be honest, that book is dry. It is like a textbook. Would not recommend. But Waking the Tiger by Dr. Peter Levine is so digestible. It is really easy to understand. So if you're someone who wants to explore that idea of how trauma lives in the body, Waking the Tiger is definitely my number one pick. Deb Dana also teaches in this realm, and she's got a lot of information out there on polyvagal theory. I believe her book, oh my gosh, I can see it in my mind's eye. It has a tree on the cover, and I have it on my bedside table, but it's totally escaping me. I'll send it to you for the links in the show notes. Her work is excellent. If you want to understand how microdosing and psilocybin specifically work with female bodies, Jen Chesek, who is a amazing medical journalist, I had her on my podcast. She wrote a book called the Psilocybin Handbook for Women. Excellent book. And then I also always recommend Burning Woman by Lucy H. Pierce. Oof. That one is such an activating book. I have almost all of my clients read it. It's just such a wonderful call to action, and that action being the reconnection to you as the feminine. It is, she talks about like the woman on fire. Like it is an inflaming read for some folks and highly triggering. And for me, it was just like coming home. It felt so good. So those are the books and podcasts that I would recommend.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing those. We'll detail the information in the show notes to get that easy access for the listeners. And I love the book that you suggested, Waking the Tiger. I absolutely am going to pick that up because that just sounds so great. Okay, so really, before we close the show, is there anything that you haven't shared that you think the listeners absolutely need to know about microdosing or womb work or any of that you would like to share now?
I think the only thing around microdosing that's always important to know is that this is a very safe modality for a lot of people. And there are some people that it might not be safe for. And so those people may have a direct family history of schizophrenia or bipolar. They may also have heart issues. And the best way to understand if this is a contraindication for you is to either talk to somebody who is a trained professional or talk to your doctor. The research is constantly changing. For the longest time, we thought that trazodone and tramadol were contraindicators, and now they're saying maybe they're not. So, like, this is an ever-evolving space. But if you're someone who's questioning and wants a little bit more guidance, I can help. There's other folks who can help too. And as for everything else, I guess I'll just share that none of this is a magic pill. Microdose it is not a magic pill. Somatic work, not a magic pill. Womb reconnection, not a magic pill. Your magic. You have all of the wisdom within yourself. And these are some really wonderful, in my opinion, ways to help awaken that magic and awaken that wisdom within you. But there are others too.
That's tremendous. Thank you for pointing those things out. I think you're absolutely right. It's important to know and talk with a professional, talk with somebody who knows what they're doing to make sure that this is right for you. So yeah, absolutely great stuff. Leslie, would you please share with the listeners how they can find you? Are you on social media, website? They want to follow your journey, want to ask you more questions. How would they do that?
So I am on Instagram at Leslie Draffin, but of course, the way that the socials like to do things, who can say? So the best way for you to get in touch with me, and it goes actually really beautifully with this, is to head to the show notes, download the shift method, which will also put you onto my email list. And in the shift method, there's a link to book a free discovery call with me. If you're someone who's listening to this and you feel really sick and tired of being disconnected to yourself, maybe you feel like anxiety is ruling your life and you feel like your interest is piqued about maybe microdosing for more mindfulness, then I would love to invite you to book that call. The shift method will be a wonderful tool for you. And then we can talk about the possibility of working one-on-one. I also have a group that I run called Mindful Microdosing. And so those are really the ways that I think would be most helpful for folks. I have a website, lesliedraffin.com. And like Desiree shared, I'm doing all the things, YouTube, podcast. Who knows what else I'll be doing by January of 25, but that's the way I think. Those are the big ways.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those, Leslie. And absolutely, all the details will be in the show notes. And thank you for sharing again the shift method. Good stuff. Leslie, this has been just wonderful. I have been so honored by your time and your knowledge and all of this that you've shared with us. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. We'll talk more soon. Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Pockets of Knowledge podcast. We appreciate your time and curiosity as we explore fascinating topics together. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to join us next week for another amazing episode. Remember, your journey of learning and growth is a continuous adventure, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next week, stay curious and keep exploring those pockets of knowledge.